My name is Amelia Hayes, and I'm a forensic accountant. It's not a glamorous job. There are no red carpets, no flashy parties, just me, a mountain of data, and the quiet satisfaction of finding the truth hidden in the numbers. My life is built on logic, on patterns, on the principle that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But last Tuesday, I learned that some reactions are more explosive than others. It all started with a phone call, the kind that rips a hole in the quiet fabric of your ordinary life. It was my sister, Clara, her voice a shredded mess of sobs and sheer panic. "Amelia, it's gone," she wailed, the words barely intelligible. "The house, the cars. Ethan's been arrested. The feds are here. It's all gone." As I stood in my quiet, modest apartment, listening to the world she had so carefully constructed crumble into dust, I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. Because this wasn't just a random tragedy that had befallen her. This was the consequence. The equal and opposite reaction to a decision she had made 3 months earlier, a decision that began with a single, embossed envelope delivered to my door. The real story, the one that led to federal agents on her perfectly manicured lawn, started the day my own sister banned me from her wedding. If you've ever felt like the odd one out in your own family, the quiet one in a room full of noise, then you're going to want to hear this. What happened next wasn't just about a wedding or a mansion. It was about the lies we tell ourselves and the price of keeping up appearances. Before I take you back to that moment, to the feel of that heavy cardstock in my hands, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story that I think will resonate no matter where you are. To understand Clara, you have to understand the ecosystem of our family. We grew up in a world of comfortable suburban privilege, but within that world, there were two very different orbits. Clara's orbit was the Sunday. She was beautiful, radiant, effortlessly charming. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and have everyone eating out of the palm of her hand within minutes. She never had to try. Things just came to her. Good grades came with a dazzling smile at the teacher. Prom queen came with her natural popularity, and financial help from our parents came with a well-timed, dramatic sigh about how hard life was. My orbit, on the other hand, was somewhere out past Pluto. I was the quiet one, the studious one. While Clara was practicing her acceptance speech for homecoming court, I was teaching myself how to code. While she was mastering the art of the perfect selfie, I was mastering calculus. Our parents, bless their hearts, loved us both, but they managed us differently. Clara was a delicate flower to be protected and admired, while I was a sturdy oak, expected to weather any storm without complaint. "Oh, let Amelia handle it, she's so good with details," was a common refrain in our house. And I did. I handled the taxes, the investment planning for our parents' retirement, the logistics of every family vacation. I was the family's designated adult, a role I was given around the age of 12. Clara's life was a curated gallery of perfection. Her social media was a testament to this, a never-ending stream of sun-drenched vacations, exclusive parties, and, for the past year, fawning posts about her fiancé, Ethan Thorne. Ethan was, in a word, perfect. At least, on paper. He was a self-made tech entrepreneur, the founder of a buzzy investment firm called VentureSpire. He was handsome, charismatic, and showered Clara with gifts that made my sensible, twice a year on sale shoes curl in second-hand embarrassment. First came the Rolex, then the Porsche, and finally, the crown jewel. A sprawling, $2.8 million modern mansion in the most exclusive gated community in the state. The house was Clara's ultimate validation. It was white and glass and chrome, with an infinity pool that overlooked a private lake. It was featured in lifestyle magazines. It was the backdrop for 90% of her Instagram content. It was, to her, proof that she had won at life. I, on the other hand, was a source of mild, unspoken disappointment. I had a good job at a prestigious financial firm in the city, but it was a job, not a lifestyle. I lived in a comfortable but unremarkable apartment. I drove a reliable 5-year-old sedan. I didn't have a fiancé who looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne ad. I had my career, my small circle of loyal friends, and my quiet, orderly life. To Clara, this was the equivalent of failure. "Oh, Ames," she'd say, her voice dripping with pity that felt more like acid. "Don't you ever want more?" What she meant was, "Don't you ever want to be me?" The wedding was set to be the social event of the year. It was her magnum opus, the culmination of a lifetime of aspiring to a certain kind of perfection. The venue was a historic estate. The dress was a custom Vera Wang. The guest list was a who's who of the local elite. And I, as her sister, was meant to be the maid of honor. I tried to be excited for her. I truly did. I went to the dress fittings. I listened to her agonize for hours over the exact shade of ivory for the napkins. I nodded and smiled as she described the ice sculpture that would be carved in their likeness. But as a forensic accountant, my brain is trained to spot anomalies, the little details that don't add up. And the more I was around Ethan, the more my internal alarm bells started to ring. It wasn't just the extravagant spending. It was the way he talked about his business. He used a lot of buzzwords: synergy, disruption, next-gen leveraging, but when I'd ask a specific, pointed question about his revenue model or his debt-to-asset ratio, he'd just flash a brilliant white smile and change the subject. "Amelia, Amelia," he'd chuckle, patting my arm condescendingly. "Leave the boring numbers stuff to me. Just get ready to be the best-looking maid of honor anyone's ever seen." Oh, Ben. The breaking point, the moment that set this entire catastrophe in motion, came during a family dinner at the new mansion. The place was breathtaking, I'll admit. It felt less like a home and more like a luxury hotel lobby. As we sat on the ridiculously uncomfortable white leather sofas, Ethan was holding court, telling a story about a massive deal he'd just closed. We acquired a portfolio of distressed assets in the renewable energy sector, he announced, puffing out his chest. The initial projection is a 300% return for our primary investors within 6 months. My parents were practically salivating. Clara looked at him like he'd just single-handedly solved world hunger. But I knew the market for those specific assets. They were incredibly volatile. And a 300% return in 6 months wasn't just optimistic. It was statistically impossible without either insider information or massive, undisclosed risk. So, I did what I always do. I asked a question. "That's fascinating, Ethan," I said, my tone even. "Which regulatory body oversees those specific asset classes? I'd be interested to read the public prospectus." The room went silent. Ethan's smile froze on his face. Clara shot me a look of pure venom. "Amelia, for God's sake," she hissed. "Can you not be an accountant for 5 minutes? We're celebrating." I tried to backtrack, to say I was just curious from a professional standpoint, but the damage was done. I had pricked the balloon of their perfect fantasy with the tiny, sharp pin of reality. 2 days later, the invitation arrived. Not a personal visit, not a phone call. An envelope. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a beautifully printed card that said, "We cordially invite you to celebrate the marriage of Clara Hayes and Ethan Thorne." But my name wasn't on it. Tucked behind it was a smaller, much plainer note, written in Clara's perfect, looping script. It read, "Amelia, after a lot of thought, Ethan and I have decided that it would be best if you attend our wedding as a guest. The role of maid of honor requires unconditional support, and frankly, your constant negativity and questioning of Ethan's success has created a toxic environment. We want our special day to be surrounded by positivity only. We've asked my friend Madison to step in. I'm sure you understand. I read it 3 times, the words blurring together. It wasn't a demotion. It was an exile. Banned. She had banned me from her wedding party, from standing beside her, all because I asked a single, logical question. I sank onto my sofa, the heavy invitation feeling like a tombstone in my hand. I didn't understand then. I didn't see the whole picture. All I felt was the cold, sharp sting of a lifetime of being pushed aside, of being the sensible one they would never truly see or value. But my analytical mind couldn't let it go. Her reaction was too extreme, too defensive. It wasn't just about a question. It was about what that question threatened to expose. And as I sat there, heartbroken and humiliated, a professional instinct I couldn't suppress began to kick in. I didn't know it yet, but my sister had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She hadn't just banned me from her wedding. She had just put a forensic accountant on the scent of a lie. The week after receiving that cold, dismissive note from Clara was one of the lowest points of my life. The humiliation was a physical weight, a constant pressure in my chest. I called her, of course. The first time, it went to voicemail. The second time, she picked up, her voice airy and distant, as if she were talking to a telemarketer. "Oh, hi, Ames. I'm in the middle of a cake tasting. Is it important?" I tried to explain how hurt I was, how a simple conversation could have avoided this, but she cut me off. "Honestly, Amelia, you're being so dramatic. This is my wedding, and I just need people around me who get it. You don't get it. You don't get Ethan. You don't get our life. It's better this way." And then she hung up. My mother called later, her voice a nervous flutter. "Clara told me what happened, honey. Just try to see it from her perspective. She's under so much pressure. This wedding is everything to her. Just let it go and be a good sport." Be a good sport. That was my role. The sturdy oak. Bend, but don't break. Absorb the blow and pretend it didn't hurt. For years, that's exactly what I had done. This wasn't the first time my well-being had been sacrificed for Clara's happiness. I remembered when we were in college. She'd overspent her allowance again on a spring break trip to Cancun she couldn't afford. She called me, sobbing, saying she'd maxed out the credit card our parents gave her for emergencies and couldn't pay her tuition bill. If she didn't pay, she'd be kicked out of her sorority, she'd be humiliated, her life would be over, so I did what I always did. I took the money I had painstakingly saved up from my work-study job, the money I was going to use for a down payment on a reliable car to get to my internship, and I paid her bill. All $5,000 of it. "I'll pay you back, Ames, I swear," she'd promised through her tears. I never saw a dime of it. 2 weeks later, her Instagram was full of pictures of her doing tequila shots on a beach, hashtagged #BestLife. When I gently reminded her about the money a few months later, she rolled her eyes. "God, Amelia, you're not going to hold that over my head forever, are you?" It was a loan from family. My sacrifice was reduced to an inconvenience, a footnote in the grand story of her fabulous life. Then there was the time, just after I'd landed my first real job, that she decided she wanted to be an influencer. She needed a professional camera, a new laptop, a wardrobe to match her desired aesthetic. Our parents, who were starting to worry about their retirement fund, hesitated. So Clara came to me. She painted a beautiful picture of her future success, of brand deals and sponsorships. It was an investment, she said, an investment in her future. I was just starting out, paying off student loans, living on a shoestring budget, but I saw the desperation in her eyes, and that old familiar sense of responsibility kicked in. I co-signed a loan for her, putting my own perfect credit score on the line. For 6 months, she made the payments. Then they stopped. The bank called me. When I confronted Clara, she was indignant. The algorithm changed. It's not my fault. My engagement is down. I can't be creative when I'm stressed about money. I ended up working a second job on weekends for a year, doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses, just to pay off her influencer debt so it wouldn't destroy my financial future. She never so much as thanked me. In her mind, that's just what I did. I was the fixer, the safety net, the sturdy, boring oak in the background of her sun-drenched life. This time felt different, though. This wasn't about money. This was about my place in her life, in our family. Banning me from her bridal party was a public declaration. It was her saying, "You with your questions and your logic and your sensible shoes, you don't belong in this perfect picture I've created." The pain of that rejection was sharp, but underneath it, something else was stirring. Professional curiosity. A deep, unshakable feeling that I was right. Clara's violent overreaction was the biggest red flag of all. People who have nothing to hide don't act like that. They don't banish their own sister for asking a simple question about a financial prospectus. They answer the question. It was the kind of behavior I saw at work all the time from executives trying to cover up a bad quarter or hide fraudulent activity. It was a tell. I tried to let it go. I really did. I unsubscribed from Clara's Instagram feed. I muted the family group chat. I threw myself into my work, hoping to bury my hurt under spreadsheets and financial reports. And for a couple of weeks, it almost worked. Then, a name crossed my desk that made my blood run cold. I was assigned to a new client at my firm, a man named Mr. Abernathy. He was a retired widower in his late 70s, a kind, gentle soul who had entrusted our firm to manage his life savings after his wife passed away. During our initial consultation, he mentioned a recent private investment he had made on the advice of a friend. "It's a wonderful new company," he said, his eyes twinkling. "They're doing incredible things with technology and renewable energy. The young man who runs it is so impressive. I think you've heard of them. VentureSpire?" I kept my face a perfect mask of professional neutrality, but inside, my stomach twisted into a knot. "Yes, I've heard the name," I said carefully. "They've been getting a lot of buzz." Miss Abernathy beamed. "Exactly. My friend said it's the opportunity of a lifetime. I put in a significant portion of my portfolio. Ethan, that's the CEO. He promised me a 300% return in 6 months. There it was again. That impossible number. The exact same number he had quoted at that disastrous family dinner. It wasn't just a boast to impress my parents. It was his official pitch. He was promising this to retirees, to people like Mr. Abernathy who were investing the money they needed to live on. The vague unease I'd been feeling hardened into a cold, heavy certainty. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was my job. Mr. Abernathy was my client, my firm, and by extension, I had a fiduciary duty to protect his assets. "That sounds like an impressive return, Mr. Abernathy," I said, choosing my words with extreme care. "As part of our due diligence in taking over your portfolio, we'll need to do a thorough risk assessment on all your current holdings, including private investments like VentureSpire. It's just standard procedure." He nodded, completely at ease. "Of course. Of course. Whatever you need to do, my dear. I'm in good hands here." As he left my office, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. This was it. The point of no return. I now had a legal and ethical obligation to investigate Ethan Thorne's company. My sister had tried to push me out of her life, to cast me as the villain in her fairy tale. But in a twist of fate she could never have imagined, she had inadvertently led me right to the dragon's lair. And I was the one person in the world perfectly equipped to slay it. The ghost in the numbers, The anomaly I had sensed from the beginning was no longer just a feeling. It was a case file on my desk, and I was about to find out exactly what kind of skeletons Ethan Thorne had hidden in his closet. The moment I opened the Venture Spire case file, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The personal hurt, the sting of my sister's rejection, receded into the background. This was my territory. In the world of forensic accounting, numbers don't have emotions. They don't lie, they don't have ulterior motives. They either add up or they don't. My job was to find out why. My boss, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Catherine, called me into her office. "Abernathy's file," she said, getting straight to the point. "He has a 7-figure position in a private equity firm I've never heard of. Venture Spire. What do we know?" I handed her my preliminary notes. "Founded 18 months ago by Ethan Thorne. Private company, so public financials are limited. They market themselves as a high-yield fund specializing in tech startups and distressed energy assets. Their marketing materials promise unusually high, short-term returns." Catherine raised an eyebrow, a sign of deep skepticism. "Unusually high is a red flag. What's their registration status with the SEC?" she asked. "That's the first thing I checked," I replied. "They filed a Form D exemption under Rule 506 EC, which allows them to raise an unlimited amount of money from accredited investors without the standard SEC registration. It's a common loophole for private funds, but it also means less regulatory oversight. In other words, they were operating in the shadows, where it was easier to hide things." Catherine leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "So, they're targeting wealthy, often elderly, investors with the promise of impossible returns and using a regulatory loophole to avoid scrutiny. I've seen this movie before, Amelia. Dig deep. I want to know everything. Who are their auditors? Who is their custodian bank? I want a full workup. Abernathy is a legacy client. We don't let our legacy clients get fleeced." I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the green light I needed. This wasn't me being a vindictive sister. This was me doing my job at the explicit direction of my superior. I spent the next 2 days doing a deep dive into the digital footprint of Venture Spire and Ethan Thorne. The company website was slick, full of stock photos of diverse, happy people in boardrooms and testimonials from satisfied investors. I ran a reverse image search on the headshots. Every single one of them was a stock photo model. The testimonial from John D., a retired surgeon from Palm Beach, was attributed to a man whose face was also used to sell life insurance in Germany and promote a dental clinic in Australia. It was amateurish, a mistake a legitimate multi-million-dollar firm would never make. It was the first crack in the facade. Next, I looked into Ethan Thorne himself. His LinkedIn profile was impressive. A degree from a prestigious business school, a series of impressive-sounding jobs at various investment banks before he struck out on his own to found Venture Spire. I started making quiet, discreet calls to contacts I had at those banks, citing a routine background check for a potential merger, a little white lie to protect the investigation. The story began to unravel. One contact said, "Ethan Thorne? Yeah. He was here for about 6 months in an entry-level analyst program. Talented guy, but he was fired for, let's call it, ethical irregularities with his expense reports." Another contact at a different firm laughed. "Thorne? Oh man, that guy was a legend. He lasted 3 months. He wasn't an investment banker. He was in the marketing department. We let him go after he grossly exaggerated the performance of a fund in a client presentation. His entire resume was a carefully constructed fiction. He hadn't climbed the corporate ladder. He had been kicked off the first few rungs. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Venture Spire's official address was a prestigious office building downtown. but a quick search of the building's directory showed they didn't have a full office. They had a virtual office mailbox, a P.O. box with a fancy address. They claimed to have a team of seasoned analysts, but I couldn't find a single employee on LinkedIn other than Ethan. The auditors they listed on their marketing materials? I called the auditing firm. They had never heard of VentureSpire, the custodian bank where they claimed investor funds were held securely. The bank confirmed VentureSpire had a simple business checking account with them, not a custodial account, meaning Ethan had direct, unchecked access to the funds. There were no safeguards. There were no checks and balances. Investor money was going straight into his personal war chest. My heart hammered in my chest as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just a poorly run company. This wasn't just an inexperienced CEO making rookie mistakes. This was a deliberate, calculated fraud from the ground up. Every single aspect of VentureSpire was a lie. Ethan Thorne hadn't built a company. He had constructed a stage. A very elaborate, expensive stage designed for one purpose: to lure in unsuspecting investors like Mr. Abernathy and steal their money. And the props for this stage? The flashy car, the expensive watches, the gushing magazine articles he had likely paid a PR firm to place, and the $2.8 million mansion. I suddenly understood the mansion in a terrifying new light. It wasn't just a home. It was his single most important marketing tool. It was the physical proof of his success, the thing that made his unbelievable promises seem believable. No one would question the legitimacy of a man who lived in a house like that. It was the cornerstone of his entire deception. I worked late into the night, my office illuminated only by the glow of my dual monitors. I felt a grim, nauseating certainty settling in my stomach. Ethan was running a Ponzi scheme. It was the classic model. Use money from new investors to pay returns to early investors, all while siphoning off millions for himself to fund his lavish lifestyle. These schemes always collapse. It's not a matter of if, but when. The only thing that keeps them going is a constant influx of new money. And what's the best way to attract new, high-value investors? A spectacular high-society wedding, covered by every luxury blog and magazine in the state. The wedding wasn't just a celebration of his love for my sister. It was a business expense. It was a marketing event designed to be the ultimate showcase of his wealth and success, a net to catch a whole new school of unsuspecting fish. My sister wasn't just his fiancée. She was his unwitting accomplice, the co-star in his fraudulent production. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Clara, with her obsession with appearances and her desperate need for validation, was the perfect partner for a man like Ethan. She didn't question his success. She reveled in it. She didn't care about the details. She only cared about the aesthetic. He had found in her the perfect, unquestioning believer who would help sell his lie to the world. And she had found in him the man who could give her the life she always felt she deserved. They were a match made in fraudulent heaven. The sick irony was that by banning me, by pushing away the one person who was trained to see the truth behind the fantasy, Clara had thought she was protecting her perfect world. Instead, she had just ensured its complete and utter destruction. I leaned back in my chair, the evidence laid out before me on my screens, a web of lies, deceit, and stolen fortunes. The first crack had become a chasm, and I was staring straight into the abyss. The question now was no longer what was happening, but what in the world I was going to do about it. The weight of my discovery pressed down on me over the next few days, a constant, heavy presence. It was one thing to suspect a fraud. It was another entirely to hold the cold, hard proof of it in your hands, especially when that proof was inextricably linked to your own family's impending implosion. Every time I looked at the file, I saw Mr. Abernathy's kind, trusting face, and my stomach churned. He had invested over $1 million, the nest egg he and his late wife had built over 50 years of hard work with a con man. And he wasn't the only one. Using my firm's access to sophisticated financial tracking software, I was able to start mapping the flow of funds into Venture Spire's accounts. I identified at least a dozen other investors, many of them elderly, all of them wealthy and well-respected members of the community. The total was staggering. By my initial estimate, Ethan had taken in over $20 million in the last 18 months. The more I investigated the outflow of that money, the clearer the picture of the Ponzi scheme became. I saw large payments going out to a handful of early investors, which I cross-referenced and discovered were likely friends of Ethan's, plants to help legitimize the operation. These were the returns he was paying out, creating the illusion of a profitable company. But the vast majority of the money was being funneled elsewhere. I traced millions to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I saw hundreds of thousands spent on luxury cars, not just the Porsche for Clara, but a Lamborghini and a vintage Aston Martin for himself. There were wires for private jet rentals, five-star hotel stays in Monaco, and a single American Express bill for over $200,000 that included a shopping spree at every high-end designer boutique on Rodeo Drive. He wasn't just living a lavish lifestyle. He was burning through his investors' money with a reckless, almost desperate abandon. Then I focused on the mansion. A property search confirmed it was purchased for $2.8 million. However, it wasn't bought with cash. It had a massive mortgage from a high-risk private lender, the kind that charges exorbitant interest rates. But that wasn't the worst of it. I uncovered a second and then a third lien against the property. Ethan had been using the mansion as collateral, borrowing against its equity over and over again to generate more liquid cash, likely to pay the returns to his early investors and keep the scheme afloat. The house wasn't an asset. It was a Jenga tower of debt, leveraged to its absolute limit. A single missed payment, a single fluctuation in the market, and the whole thing would come crashing down. Clara wasn't the queen of her castle. She was living in a house of cards, blissfully unaware that a strong wind was coming. The most damning piece of evidence came from a source deep within the banking system. One of the wire transfers to his offshore account had been flagged by a compliance officer at the bank for its size and destination. It was a routine Suspicious Activity Report, or SAR, filed with the Treasury Department. It was an internal document, not public, but through my firm's official channels, citing our investigation on behalf of a victim, we were able to request information related to our client's funds. The report showed that Ethan had falsified the reason for the wire, claiming it was for a capital investment in a European tech firm. The firm didn't exist. He was just hiding the money. This was the smoking gun. This was no longer just a case of civil fraud. This was felony wire fraud and money laundering. He wasn't just going to lose the money. He was going to prison. As the days turned into a week, the pressure of what I knew became almost unbearable. I couldn't sleep. Food tasted like ash. At work, I was a machine, methodically compiling the data into a bulletproof report, but inside, I was a wreck. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat, expecting it to be Clara, either to yell at me again or, in a fantasy I couldn't shake, to apologize. But the calls never came. The only updates I got were through my mother, who would call to give me cheerful, oblivious reports on the wedding planning. "They've booked the florist, Amelia. They're having orchids flown in from Hawaii. Can you imagine?" she'd gush. "And Clara's final dress fitting is next week. She looks like a princess. Ethan is just the most wonderful man. He's even offered to help your father and me with our retirement portfolio. Isn't that generous?" I felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't being generous. He was scouting his next victims. I had to bite my tongue so hard I tasted blood to keep from screaming the truth down the phone line. "That's great, Mom," was all I could manage. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place one evening as I was cross-referencing dates on the bank statements. The largest withdrawals, the biggest offshore transfers, the most extravagant purchases, they all coincided with major wedding-related expenses. The down payment on the historic estate, the wire transfer for Clara's custom gown, the booking of a famous band for the reception. He wasn't just using the wedding as a tool to find new investors. He was actively looting the company to pay for it. His investors were funding every last orchid, every bottle of champagne, every single detail of my sister's dream wedding. And the timeline told me something else, something even more terrifying. The rate of his spending was accelerating. The scheme was in its final, most desperate phase. He was running out of new investors to pay off the old ones. He needed one last massive infusion of cash to keep it from collapsing. The wedding was his Hail Mary. He was counting on the publicity and the high-profile guest list to reel in a new group of multi-millionaire investors who could keep the game going. But the numbers showed he was already on the brink. By my calculations, he had maybe a month, 6 weeks at most, before the whole rotten structure collapsed on its own. I sat in my office, staring out at the city lights, the finished report, a heavy, ominous stack of paper on my desk. It contained everything: the fake testimonials, the fabricated resume, the shell company, the offshore accounts, the liens on the mansion, the wire fraud. It was a detailed, undeniable roadmap of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. And the man at the center of it was about to marry my sister. I thought about Clara, so happy, so proud, living her perfect life in her perfect house, planning her perfect wedding. She had banned me to protect that perfection, to eliminate the one person whose quiet, analytical nature felt like a threat. She had no idea that the real threat was sleeping next to her every night. She thought I was the storm cloud on her sunny day, when in reality, she was blissfully planning a picnic in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. The house of cards was trembling, and I was the only one who could see it. I had the power to either let the storm hit and destroy everything in its path, or to sound the alarm. But sounding the alarm would mean being the one to personally light the match that burned my sister's world to the ground. For 48 hours, I lived in a state of suspended animation. The report sat locked in my desk drawer at the office, a ticking time bomb. Every time I walked past that drawer, I could almost feel the heat radiating from it. My life was split into two realities. In one, I was Amelia Hayes, a forensic accountant who had uncovered a major criminal fraud and had a clear, professional, and ethical duty to report it. In the other, I was Amelia Hayes, a sister who held the power to obliterate her family. The two realities were at war within me, and the collateral damage was my sanity. I'd be in the middle of a meeting, discussing quarterly earnings reports, and my mind would suddenly flash to Clara's face when she learned her entire life was a lie. I'd be making coffee in the break room, and I'd be paralyzed by the thought of my parents, how this news would absolutely devastate them, not just emotionally, but potentially financially, as they were considering letting Ethan manage their retirement fund. I knew what I was supposed to do. My professional code of conduct was unambiguous. My duty to my client, Mr. Abernathy, was paramount. My firm's reputation was on the line. And beyond all that, there was the simple, human cost. Dozens of people, many of whom had worked their entire lives to build their savings, were on the verge of losing everything. My inaction would make me complicit, but the knowledge of my duty did little to quiet the screaming voice of doubt in my head. This wasn't an anonymous white-collar criminal. This was the man my sister loved. This was the man who was about to become my brother-in-law. Reporting him would mean the end of Clara's engagement, the cancellation of the wedding she had dreamed of her entire life, the public humiliation of our family name, and the very real possibility that my sister would never, ever forgive me. She already saw me as a jealous, negative force in her life. This act, no matter how justified, would cement that perception forever. I would be the villain of her story, the jealous sister who destroyed her happiness. I tried to rationalize a different path. Maybe I could talk to Clara. Maybe if I went to her, not as a forensic accountant, but as her sister, and laid out my concerns, she would listen. I played the scene out in my head 100 times. I would go to the mansion, sit her down on one of those soulless white sofas, and gently explain. Clara, I'm worried about Ethan. I've seen some things, some inconsistencies in his business that are concerning. But I knew exactly how she would react. I could hear her sharp, incredulous laugh. Oh my God, Amelia, are you still on this? You're obsessed. You can't stand that I'm happy. So you're inventing these insane conspiracy theories to ruin it for me. You're pathetic. She wouldn't believe me. She would see it as an attack, as the ultimate act of jealousy. And worse, she would immediately tell Ethan. He would know I was onto him. He would have time to cover his tracks, to move more money, to disappear, leaving his investors and my sister with nothing but the wreckage. A direct confrontation was not only futile, it was dangerous. Then I considered going to my parents. But that scenario was just as bleak. My father, a man who respected success above all else, was completely dazzled by Ethan. He saw him as the son he'd always wanted. My mother was swept up in the romance and the glamour of it all. If I went to them, they would likely accuse me of the same thing as Clara, jealousy. They would tell me to stop causing trouble, to be happy for my sister. They would try to mediate, which would involve them telling me to apologize to Clara and Ethan for my accusations. They would choose the beautiful, comfortable lie over the ugly, inconvenient truth. They always had. I was completely and utterly alone in this. The turning point came on a Thursday night. I was working late, staring at my computer screen, when an email popped up. It was from Mr. Abernathy's granddaughter. She was writing to thank me and my firm for managing his finances. He's so much less stressed knowing a professional is keeping an eye on things, she wrote. He was so excited about that VentureSpire investment. He keeps talking about how the returns will be enough to pay for his great-grandchildren's college education. It gives him such a sense of purpose. I read the email, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. This wasn't an abstract problem about numbers on a page anymore. This was about a good man's legacy. It was about the future he wanted to provide for the people he loved. Ethan wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing dreams. He was stealing futures. And my sister, my own sister, was the smiling, beautiful face he was using to do it. In that moment, the war inside me ended. A cold, hard clarity washed over me. This wasn't about Clara. It wasn't about my parents. It wasn't about me or my hurt feelings over a wedding invitation. This was bigger than my family. This was about right and wrong. It was about protecting the vulnerable from the predatory. My sister was a grown woman who had made her choices. She had chosen the life Ethan offered, and she had chosen to push me away. I couldn't save her from the consequences of those choices, but I could save Mr. Abernathy. I could save the other dozen investors I had identified. I could stop Ethan from hurting anyone else. My loyalty to my family had been a one-way street for my entire life. I had given, and they had taken. My loyalty now had to be to my principles. I stayed at the office until 3 a.m., finalizing the report. I printed 3 copies. It was over 200 pages long, filled with bank statements, property records, email transcripts, and a detailed narrative of the entire fraudulent scheme. It was a meticulously crafted instrument of destruction. As I drove home through the empty city streets, I felt a profound sense of grief. I was mourning a relationship with my sister that I now knew was probably never real. I was mourning the family I wished I had. I was mourning the fact that I had been forced into a position where doing the right thing felt like the most profound act of betrayal. When I got home, I pulled out my phone. I scrolled to Clara's contact photo, a smiling picture of her and Ethan on a yacht, the sun glinting off their perfect teeth. My finger hovered over the call button. I could still try one last time. I could give her one last chance to listen. But I knew it was hopeless. I put the phone down. The choice had been made. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into Catherine's office, put the report on her desk, and set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. I was no longer just the sturdy oak, bending in the wind. I was the lightning strike that was about to set the whole forest on fire. The next morning, I walked into my office feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I was wearing my most severe professional suit, charcoal gray, sharp lines, no frills. It felt like armor. The 200-page report was in my briefcase, its weight a constant physical reminder of what I was about to do. I didn't allow myself to hesitate. I walked straight to Catherine's office. Her door was open, and she was already on the phone, her expression intense. She saw me, held up a single finger to indicate she'd be a moment, and continued her call. I stood in the doorway, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This was the final checkpoint, the last moment before the domino would fall. "What have you got, Amelia?" she asked as soon as she hung up, her eyes already focused on the thick, bound report in my hands. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and placed all 3 copies on her large mahogany desk. "It's worse than we thought," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "It's a Ponzi scheme. A comprehensive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme." Catherine's face, normally a mask of calm composure, registered a flicker of shock. She reached for the top copy, her movements deliberate, and opened it to the executive summary. For the next 15 minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper as she turned the pages. I watched her eyes scan the key findings, the fabricated track record of the CEO, the non-existent auditors, the offshore accounts, the use of new investor funds to pay fraudulent returns, the leveraging of the mansion. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "This is incredibly thorough, Amelia, and incredibly damning." She closed the report and folded her hands on top of it. "You're certain of all this? The evidence is irrefutable?" "Every claim is backed by primary source documentation," I confirmed. "Bank records, property deeds, corporate filings, and a filed suspicious activity report. It's airtight." She nodded slowly, her gaze analytical, but with a new hint of sympathy. She knew, of course. In the small world of high finance, everyone knew everyone. She knew who Ethan Thorne was engaged to. She knew this wasn't just another case for me. "This puts the firm in a difficult position," she said, though her tone told me the decision was already made. "We have a legal and ethical obligation to act on this information. Our first duty is to our client, Mr. Abernathy. Our second is to the integrity of the financial system. We cannot, under any circumstances, allow this to continue." I felt a strange wave of relief wash over me. The burden was no longer solely mine. It was the firm's. The decision was now corporate policy, a matter of legal necessity. "What are the next steps?" I asked. "First," she said, picking up her phone, "we get our legal counsel in here. They will review your findings and draft the official report. Second, we will file that report with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. We will also be required to notify the FBI, as your findings clearly indicate criminal activity, specifically wire fraud and money laundering." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "Amelia, once we do this, it's out of our hands. The federal government will take over. Their investigation will be swift and their actions will be decisive. Are you prepared for the fallout from that? I took a deep breath. Yes, I said, the word feeling both small and enormous at the same time. I am. The rest of the day was a blur of high-stakes meetings. The firm's top lawyers, a team of stone-faced men and women who billed at $2,000 an hour, descended on Catherine's office. They grilled me for hours, picking apart every detail of my report, looking for any weakness, any hole in my logic. I answered every question calmly and precisely, citing page numbers and exhibit references from memory. By late afternoon, they were convinced. The lead counsel, a man named Mr. Davenport, turned to Catherine. Your analyst is correct. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of criminal fraud I've seen in years. We are not only obligated to report this, we would be exposed to massive liability if we didn't. We need to file with the SEC by morning. The machine was in motion. The gears were turning, grinding forward with an unstoppable momentum. A junior lawyer was tasked with preparing the formal submission package. Another was on the phone with our contacts at the SEC's Enforcement Division, giving them a confidential heads-up that a major fraud report was coming their way. I was excused from the meetings around 5 p.m., the lawyers now huddled with Catherine to plan the firm's strategy for managing the fallout, communicating with affected clients, and cooperating with the federal investigation. I walked back to my own office, feeling hollowed out. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a profound sense of dread. It was done. The domino had been pushed. All I could do now was wait for it to hit the next one, and the next, until the entire, carefully constructed line of my sister's life came crashing down. I packed up my briefcase, the silence of my office feeling heavy and oppressive. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I pulled out my phone. I had dozens of notifications from the family group chat. My mom had posted pictures from Clara's final dress fitting. There she was, my sister, standing on a pedestal in a cloud of white silk and lace, looking radiant, blissfully happy. The caption my mom wrote was, "Our beautiful bride. Just 1 month to go." Underneath, there were a dozen cheerful comments from aunts and cousins. Looking at that photo felt like watching a movie where you, and only you, know what's coming next. You want to scream at the characters, to warn them, but they can't hear you. They just keep walking toward the cliff's edge, smiling. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat on my couch in the dark, the city lights twinkling outside my window, and I waited. I knew how the feds worked. Once they had a credible report like ours, they didn't waste time. They would move quickly to secure assets before Ethan had a chance to flee or destroy evidence. It could be a week. It could be a day. It could be hours. Every siren I heard in the distance made me jump. Every car that passed on the street below seemed to slow down. I was a spectator to a tragedy I had authored. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. My heart stopped. I opened it, my hands shaking. The text was just a photo. A professionally shot picture of the mansion at dusk, the infinity pool glowing, the glass walls reflecting the sunset. The caption read, "Soon to be Mrs. Thorne. Some girls get all the luck. Try not to be too jealous, sis." It was so cruel, so condescending, so perfectly Clara, and it was the last thing she would ever send me before her world ended. I stared at the picture of the house, that beautiful, hollow, leveraged house of cards, and I whispered to the empty room, "It's not luck, Clara, and it's about to run out." The first domino had fallen, and the sound of its impact was going to be deafening. The call came 2 days later. It was a Friday. I was at my desk, trying to focus on a new case, but my mind was a million miles away, caught in a loop of anxious anticipation. My phone rang, displaying Catherine's extension. I picked it up on the first ring. "Turn on the news," she said, her voice tight and urgent. "Channel 8. I fumbled for the small TV in my office, my hands trembling as I switched it on. The screen flickered to life, showing a live helicopter shot. I recognized it instantly. The sweeping glass walls, the geometric roofline, the infinity pool reflecting the gray morning sky. It was Clara's mansion, but this was not a shot from a lifestyle magazine. The pristine circular driveway was filled with dark blue sedans and black SUVs, all with flashing lights. Men and women in jackets with bold yellow letters on the back. FBI were moving in and out of the front door, carrying evidence boxes. A news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking news. Federal agents raid mansion of tech entrepreneur Ethan Thorne in connection with alleged financial fraud." I sank into my chair, my breath catching in my throat. It was happening. Right now. In real time. The camera zoomed in, and I saw a figure being escorted out of the front door. It was Ethan. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The swagger was gone. The charismatic smile was replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He looked small, pathetic, a cheap suit in a world of consequences he thought he was too smart to face. They placed him in the back of one of the sedans, and the car pulled away. Then, the camera panned to a woman standing on the lawn, wrapped in a silk robe. Her arms clutched around herself. Her perfect blonde hair was a mess, her face pale and streaked with tears. It was Clara. She was just standing there, watching her entire world being dismantled box by box. Reporters were being held back by a police line at the gate of the community, their cameras and microphones all pointed at the scene of the implosion. The storm I had seen coming had finally made landfall, and it was even more destructive than I had imagined. My phone started to explode. First, it was my work email. A notification from the SEC's press office, officially announcing an emergency asset freeze against VentureSpire and its principal, Ethan Thorne, pending an investigation into a suspected Ponzi scheme. Then came the text messages. Friends who knew about my strained relationship with Clara, sending me links to the news story with messages like, "Oh my God, Amelia, are you seeing this?" I ignored them all. I was frozen, watching the live feed, watching my sister's life disintegrate on national television. The front door of the mansion was now sealed with official-looking tape. A team was changing the locks. A large tow truck was backing up to the garage, preparing to haul away the Porsche and the Lamborghini. Everything was being seized as evidence and assets to be liquidated for the victims. Then came the call I had been dreading most. It was my mother. I answered, my voice a hoarse whisper. "Hello? Amelia. Thank God. Are you watching the news? It's a mistake. It has to be a mistake." Her voice was hysterical, a frantic symphony of denial and panic. "They're saying Ethan is a criminal. They're at the house. Poor Clara is all alone. Your father and I are on our way there now. This is a nightmare. Some jealous business rival must have set him up." I listened to her theories, her desperate attempts to create an alternate reality where this wasn't happening. I couldn't tell her the truth. Not like this. Just be there for Clara, Mom," I managed to say. "She's going to need you." "What do we do, Amelia?" she sobbed. "You're the smart one, you know about these things. How do we fix this?" And that was the cruelest irony of all. The family who had mocked my boring, sensible career, who had dismissed my knowledge as irrelevant, was now turning to me in their moment of crisis, with no idea that I was the one who had set the crisis in motion. "I don't think this is something that can be fixed, Mom," I said softly, and hung up before she could ask any more questions I couldn't answer. The news reports grew more detailed throughout the day. They had a name for the case now. Operation House of Cards. The U.S. attorney held a press conference. He described VentureSpire as a predatory and parasitic scheme that specifically targeted elderly and vulnerable investors. He estimated the total fraud to be in excess of $25 million and announced that federal agents had simultaneously raided VentureSpire's virtual office and seized its bank accounts. The accounts were nearly empty. Ethan had been burning through the money as fast as it came in. The reporter mentioned that Thorne and his fiancée were just a month away from a lavish wedding. They even showed a picture of the happy couple, the same one from Clara's yacht photo, a smiling ghost from a life that no longer existed. The wedding, the reporter noted with a hint of journalistic glee, was now indefinitely postponed. I finally left the office late that afternoon, my mind numb. As I drove home, I had to pass the exit for the gated community where Clara lived. On a morbid impulse, I took it. I couldn't get past the security gate, of course, but a half-dozen news vans were still parked on the road outside. A media death watch. The story was too juicy to let go. A handsome young entrepreneur, a beautiful fiancée, a spectacular fall from grace. It was a modern-day tragedy, and the world was eating it up. I thought of Clara, inside that community somewhere, maybe at my parents' house now. Her phone would be ringing off the hook. Her friends, the ones who had flocked to her because of her wealth and status, would be distancing themselves from her as if she were contagious. The brand deals she had been so proud of would be terminated. Her perfect, curated world had been exposed as a sham, and the public humiliation would be absolute. When I got to my apartment, I felt a bone-deep exhaustion I had never known. I turned off my phone, unable to handle any more frantic calls or texts. I made a cup of tea and sat in the silence, listening to the quiet hum of my refrigerator. I had done the right thing. I had protected Mr. Abernathy and the other victims. I had stopped a criminal, but there was no sense of victory. There was no satisfaction. There was only a hollow, aching sadness. I had known this was coming. I had engineered it, but seeing it happen, seeing my sister standing broken on that lawn, seeing the life she loved being torn apart piece by piece, was a horror that no amount of preparation could have shielded me from. I had saved a dozen innocent strangers, but in the process, I had completely and utterly destroyed my own sister. The storm had passed, leaving behind a field of wreckage. And now, I had to face the survivors. The weekend was a vacuum of silence. I stayed in my apartment, a self-imposed exile, creating a buffer between me and the fallout. I knew my parents were with Clara, trying to navigate the initial shockwave. I imagined the scene. My mother's frantic attempts to soothe, my father's angry, helpless blustering, and Clara, at the center of it all, a black hole of grief and disbelief. My name, I was certain, would be a curse word in that house. They would see this as a direct result of my negativity, my jealousy. They would find a way to twist the narrative so that Ethan was a tragic victim and I was somehow the architect of his downfall, even without knowing the full truth. The thought of their misplaced blame was exhausting, but I knew it was inevitable. It was easier for them to be angry at me than to accept the devastating reality that the perfect man and the perfect life they had all admired was a complete and utter fraud. On Monday, I went back to work. The atmosphere at the firm was electric. My name was being whispered in the hallways with a mixture of awe and intimidation. I was the quiet analyst who had single-handedly brought down a $25 million Ponzi scheme. Catherine called me into her office and told me that the U.S. Attorney's Office had been in touch. They called my report the most thorough and well-documented initial complaint they had ever received from a private firm, and wanted to formally retain me as an expert consultant for the prosecution. They wanted me to help them trace the rest of the money and build the case against Ethan. It was a massive professional coup, the kind of career-defining moment I had worked for my entire life. I should have been ecstatic, Instead, I just felt numb. I accepted, of course. It was the logical next step. The news cycle moved on to the next phase, the victims. One by one, stories began to emerge of the people Ethan had swindled. There was a former pro athlete who had invested his entire retirement fund. There was a tech widow who had given Ethan the money her late husband had left her. And then, there was Mr. Abernathy. He was interviewed on the local news, his kind face etched with a quiet dignity and sadness. "I thought of him as a friend," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "He looked me in the eye and promised he would take care of me. I feel so foolish." Seeing him, hearing his words, solidified my resolve. I had made the right choice. No matter the personal cost, I had done the right thing. The court-appointed receiver had managed to freeze some of Ethan's offshore accounts, and while investors wouldn't get all their money back, my report had enabled them to recover a significant portion. If I had waited, it all would have been gone. Still, there was no word from my family. The silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I knew they must be dealing with the legal logistics, finding a lawyer for Ethan, grappling with the fact that Clara was now homeless and, for all intents and purposes, destitute. The mansion was a crime scene, sealed and seized. The cars were gone. Her bank accounts, which were joint with Ethan, were frozen. The custom Vera Wang dress, I read in a gossip column, had been seized as well, an asset purchased with stolen funds. In a single morning, Clara had gone from the pinnacle of society to a cautionary tale. She had nothing, less than nothing. She had the public shame and the association with a massive financial crime. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the raid, my phone rang. The caller ID was a blocked number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, my voice cautious. "Hello?" For a moment, there was only the sound of ragged breathing on the other end. Then, a voice, so broken and fragile, I almost didn't recognize it. "Amelia?" It was Clara. All the arrogance, all the condescension, all the airy superiority was gone. It was a voice I hadn't heard since we were children, the voice she used when she'd woken up from a nightmare. "Clara?" I said softly. A sob caught in her throat. I'm at Mom and Dad's," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know who else to call. Everyone, all my friends. They won't answer my calls. The lawyers say everything is gone. The house, the money, everything. They're saying he lied about everything." I listened, my own throat tight with a complicated mix of pity and grim validation. This was the moment I had both dreaded and, on some level, anticipated. The moment she finally had nowhere else to turn. "They won't even let me get my clothes from the house," she cried, the injustice of this small detail seeming to overwhelm her more than anything else. "My whole life was in there. And Ethan, they won't let him out on bail. They're saying he could get 20 years in prison. He keeps saying it's all a misunderstanding, but the lawyers, they look at him with such pity." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "They keep talking about a report from some financial firm that had all the evidence. They said it was so detailed, so perfect, that the case is a slam dunk. They said whoever wrote it must have been a ghost, someone who saw everything." My blood ran cold. I said nothing. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything unsaid. And then, her voice dropped to a whisper, a chilling, dawning horror in her tone. "Amelia, your job? You're an accountant, right? A forensic accountant?" The question hung in the air, a formal accusation. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place in her mind, and I knew there was no point in denying it. This was the moment of truth. "Yes, Clara," I said, my voice barely audible. "That's what I do. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, terrible silence. I could almost feel her mind reeling, connecting the dots. My negative questions at the dinner, my jealousy, my sudden banishment from the wedding, and now this. The ghost who saw everything. It wasn't a rival. It wasn't a stranger. It was me. It was you, she whispered. The words, a statement, not a question. The horror in her voice was curdling into a new emotion. Betrayal. The report. You wrote it. You did this to me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the explosion, for the screaming, for the hatred I knew was coming. I had destroyed her life, and she finally knew it. The call I had been waiting for had finally come, and it was about to get so much worse. How could you? The whisper on the other end of the line escalated into a raw, ragged scream. How could you do this to your own sister? I knew you were jealous. I knew you hated me. But I never thought you would go this far. You destroyed my life. Are you happy now, Amelia? Is this what you wanted? I let her scream. I let the torrent of pain and rage and betrayal wash over me. I deserved it, in a way. I had been the catalyst. I owed her the space to unleash her agony. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, watching the traffic moving on the street below. A world of normal people living normal lives, completely removed from the vortex of my family's drama. When her sobs finally subsided into exhausted, hiccuping breaths, I spoke, my voice quiet but firm. This wasn't about you, Clara. This was never about you or your wedding or my feelings. This was about a crime. A crime? She shrieked. This was my life, my future, my husband. He's not your husband, Clara. And he wasn't a brilliant entrepreneur. He's a con man who stole over $25 million, primarily from elderly people. He was using you. He was using your wedding. He was using our family name to lure in his next victims. And Mom and Dad were at the top of his list. There was silence on the other end. My words, cold and factual, seemed to have finally pierced through her hysteria. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice small. He was going to manage their retirement fund, I said. He was going to take everything they have, Clara. Just like he took everything from Mr. Abernathy, a 7-8-year-old widower who invested his life savings with Ethan. The money that paid for your Porsche, for your mansion, for that Vera Wang dress that was Mr. Abernathy's money. It was the money he was saving for his great-grandchildren's future. I let the weight of that sink in. I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven. For the first time, this wasn't about her loss. It was about the true nature of Ethan's gain. I didn't know, she whispered, the words sounding hollow. Of course you didn't know, I said, my voice softening slightly. That was the point. You weren't supposed to know. You were the beautiful, trusting face of his operation. But Clara, you didn't want to know. You banned me from your wedding because I asked a simple question you didn't want to hear the answer to. You surrounded yourself with positivity because the truth felt negative. You chose the fantasy, and you pushed away anyone who threatened it. Her defensiveness flared one last time. You could have warned me. You could have come to me. And what would you have done? I challenged her. Would you have believed me? Or would you have called me a jealous, bitter liar and run straight to Ethan, giving him the chance to disappear with all the money? Be honest with yourself. The silence that answered my question was all the confirmation I needed. We both knew what would have happened. I have to go, I said finally. But I will come to Mom and Dad's house on Saturday. At noon. We will all talk about this then. Together. I hung up before she could argue. The next 2 days were a tense, quiet waiting game. On Saturday, I drove to my parents' house, the house I grew up in. It felt smaller, sadder than I remembered. I walked in, and the three of them were sitting in the living room like statues in a tragic play. My father, looking aged and defeated, my mother, her eyes red and puffy, and Clara curled up on the couch, looking like a teenager again. She was wearing old sweatpants and one of my dad's oversized sweaters. The glamour was gone, stripped away, leaving behind someone I barely recognized. I didn't sit down. I stood before them, a prosecutor making her final statement. "I know you're all angry with me," I began, "and you have a right to your feelings, but you need to understand the facts." For the next hour, I laid it all out. I didn't use jargon or complicated financial terms. I told them the story. I told them about Mr. Abernathy. I told them about the other victims. I showed them the fake testimonials. I explained how the Ponzi scheme worked. I showed them the property records for the mansion, the mountain of debt it was built on. I explained that Ethan's company had been on the verge of collapse for months, and that the wedding was his last desperate attempt to find new victims to keep it afloat. I told them, as gently as I could, that if I hadn't acted, they would have been next. Their entire retirement, everything they had worked for, would be gone. My father, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for what felt like the first time in my life. "All those years," he said, his voice cracking. "All those years I pushed you to be more like your sister, more outgoing, more social. I thought your obsession with numbers was a liability. I never realized it was your greatest strength." My mother just wept silently, but it was Clara's reaction that surprised me most. I expected more anger, more accusations. Instead, she just looked empty. The truth had scoured her clean of all her illusions. "So it was all a lie," she said to no one in particular. "The whole thing, the life, the love, none of it was real." "The love might have been real to you," I said softly, "but the life was built on stolen money." She finally looked at me, her eyes clear of rage, filled only with a vast, empty sadness. "What do I do now, Amelia?" she asked, the question a genuine plea. "I have nothing. I am nothing." And in that moment, the dynamic of our entire lives shifted. She was no longer the sun, and I was no longer the distant planet. We were just two sisters in a room full of wreckage. And for the first time, she was asking me for help, not as a financial safety net, but as someone who might actually have the answers. "You start over," I said. "It's what we do. You get a job. You find an apartment you can actually afford. You learn to live without the applause and the validation of strangers on the internet. You figure out who you are without all the stuff." I saw a flicker of the old Clara. "A job? An apartment? How am I supposed to do that?" "The same way I did," I replied. "The same way everyone does. You work for it. It will be hard, and it won't be glamorous, but it will be real, and it will be yours." I reached into my bag and pulled out two things. The first was a check for a small amount of money. "This is not a handout," I said, placing it on the table. "This is a security deposit and first month's rent on a small one-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, and it's a loan. You will pay me back." The second was a business card for a therapist I knew. "And this is the most important part. You have to deal with the trauma of what happened, and you have to understand your role in it. You have to understand why you were so desperate to believe the lie. This wasn't me fixing her problems. This was me giving her the tools to start fixing them herself. This was the new boundary. I would help her up, but I would not carry her." The reckoning was over. The long, difficult process of rebuilding was about to begin. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I was sitting in a small, bustling coffee shop downtown. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the steam rising from my cup. Across from me, My sister Clara took a sip of her own latte. She looked different. Her hair was a more natural shade of blonde, pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, a sweater, and very little makeup. The designer labels were gone, but for the first time, she looked comfortable in her own skin. She had taken the check. She had gotten the apartment. It was a tiny place in a neighborhood she once would have considered a wasteland. She had also gotten a job. She was working as an assistant manager at a boutique clothing store, a real job, with long hours and difficult customers, and a steady, if modest, paycheck. The regional manager came in yesterday, she told me, a note of genuine pride in her voice. She said our store has had the highest sales increase in the district for the last quarter. She's putting me in for a promotion. That's amazing, Clara, I said, and I meant it. This small victory, earned through her own hard work, seemed to mean more to her than the mansion ever had. She had also been seeing the therapist. They were working through her need for external validation, her obsession with appearances. It was a slow, painful process, but she was doing the work. She had started paying me back for the loan, too. Every 2 weeks, a small amount was automatically transferred to my account. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about her taking responsibility. The legal case against Ethan had progressed swiftly. With my report as the roadmap, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. He had taken a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, pleading guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and money laundering. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. The name Ethan Thorne was now synonymous with disgrace. My parents were slowly adjusting to the new reality. My father had retired, and they'd had to downsize to a smaller, more manageable house. The shock had forced them to reevaluate their priorities, their definition of success. Our relationship was still a work in progress, but it was more honest than it had ever been. My father now called me for financial advice, and he actually listened to what I had to say. My mother had started volunteering at a local charity. They were finding a new purpose, one not tied to social status or reflected glory from their children. Our weekly coffee became a new ritual for Clara and me. We didn't talk about the past much. We talked about her work, about my cases, about movies we'd seen. We were getting to know each other again, not as the roles we had been assigned in our family, the golden child and the sensible one, but as two flawed, complicated adults. During one of our coffees, she looked at me across the table, her expression serious. "You know," she said quietly, "for months, I was so angry at you. I thought you took everything from me, but you didn't. You just turned the lights on, and I realized the room I was living in was a nightmare." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "You saved me, Amelia. Not just from Ethan, but from myself. Thank you." Tears pricked my eyes. It was the one thing I had never expected to hear. Forgiveness. Understanding. My own life had changed, too. The case had elevated my career to a new level. I was now a partner at my firm, leading the new forensic investigation division. But the biggest change was internal. A weight I had carried my entire life, the need for my family's approval, the sting of being perpetually undervalued was gone. I had finally proven my worth, not just to them, but to myself. I had stayed true to my principles, even when it was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. I had learned that true strength isn't about being the sturdy oak that silently endures everything. It's about being the person who has the courage to tell the truth, even when it causes a storm. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't about finance or fraud. It was that the most important balance sheet in life isn't about assets and liabilities. It's about integrity. It's about the choices you make when no one is watching, and the person you are when the curated facade is stripped away. My sister had lost her mansion, but she was slowly finding herself. And I, in a strange way, had done the same. We were both starting over, building new lives on a foundation that was finally real. The world is full of Ethans, full of beautiful lies that are much more seductive than the complicated truth. And I think many of us have dealt with situations where our own families have chosen to believe the beautiful lie. Have you ever been in a position where you had to be the one to speak an uncomfortable truth to the people you love? How did you handle it, and what was the outcome? Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if the story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Subscribe for more real-life stories, and share this with someone who might need to be reminded that their value isn't determined by anyone else's approval. Thank you for listening.